Tina Turner paid for a stranger's surgery in 1974 and told nobody. 30 years later, the man she saved finally found out. What he did next will stay with you. Robert Hines was 31 years old in the autumn of 1974, and he was going to die if someone didn't help him. Not in the abstract way that people use that phrase. He was going to die in the specific, medical, 4 days from now way that a doctor communicates when he has run out of gentler language. The tumor pressing against Robert's spine had been growing for 8 months. The surgery to remove it was not optional. It was also not possible because Robert Hines was a warehouse worker in Nashville, Tennessee, who had no health insurance, no savings worth speaking of, and a hospital that had been patient with him for as long as institutional patients allowed. The number the billing office had given him was $11,400. He had $200 in his checking account, and a wife named Dorothy, and 2 daughters aged 4 and 6 who did not yet understand why their father had been crying in the kitchen after they went to bed. He had tried everything. He had called his family, who had nothing to give. He had spoken to his church, which had raised $340 in a special collection, and given it to him with love and the implicit understanding that it was nowhere near enough. He had written to 3 charitable foundations whose addresses he found at the public library, and had received 2 form rejections and 1 silence. He had spoken to a hospital social worker who had genuine sympathy and no solutions. On the morning of October 9th, 1974, Robert Hines sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to his daughters that he folded and put in the back of the family Bible, because he did not know what else to do with the things he needed to say. Then he drove to the hospital to tell them he couldn't pay and to ask them what happened next. He never made it inside. A woman was sitting in the parking lot of the hospital in a car Robert did not recognize, a large sedan, dark blue, idling near the entrance. As Robert walked past, the window came down. The woman inside was black, roughly his age, wearing sunglasses and a scarf around her hair. He didn't recognize her. He would later say that in the state he was in that morning, he wouldn't have recognized his own brother. She said, "Are you Robert Hines?" He stopped. He said he was. She held out an envelope through the window. She said, "This is for you. Don't open it until you're inside." Then the window went up, and the car pulled away before he could say a word. Robert stood in the hospital parking lot holding a plain white envelope with his name written on the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. He stood there long enough that a nurse coming off shift asked him if he was all right. He said he was. He went inside. In the lobby, he opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check made out to Nashville General Hospital in the amount of $11,400. There was no note. There was no return address. There was nothing except the check, made out in full for the exact amount he owed, an amount he had told no one outside his immediate family and his church and the hospital billing office. Robert Hines sat down in the lobby of Nashville General Hospital and held that check in both hands and did not move for a long time. The surgery took place 4 days later. It was successful. The tumor was removed cleanly, the surgeons told Dorothy, and there was every reason to expect a full recovery. Robert spent 11 days in the hospital and came home to his daughters on a Tuesday afternoon in October, thinner than he had been and slower on his feet, but alive. Entirely. Completely. Inexplicably alive. He tried to find her. Of course he tried. He described the car to everyone who might know. A dark blue sedan, large, late model, nothing distinctive about it except that it had been idling in a hospital parking lot on a Tuesday morning with a woman inside who knew his name and the exact amount he owed. He described the woman, what little he had seen of her through a car window on a morning when he had not been paying close attention to anything except the weight of what he was carrying. He contacted the hospital billing office and asked if they had any record of who had sent the check, any name, any address, any detail that might give him a thread to pull. They had the check. They had processed it. They had no name attached to it beyond his own, and the cashier's check itself had been purchased in cash, which meant the bank had no useful record either. He contacted his church, his family, his neighbors. He called the charitable foundations he had written to, wondering if one of them had acted faster than he knew and simply not told him. None of them had. He ran out of avenues to search, and eventually, because he had 2 daughters and a wife and a job to return to and a life to rebuild after 11 days in a hospital bed, he stopped searching. He never stopped wondering. The mystery of the envelope became part of the Hines family's private mythology. The story they told at Thanksgiving and Christmas, the inexplicable good thing that had happened when everything pointed toward disaster. Dorothy had her own theory, which changed over the years depending on her mood. The girls, as they grew older, developed their own versions. Robert's version was simply this: someone had known he needed help, and they had helped him. And he owed that person a debt he had no way to repay because he didn't know who they were. He decided, in the absence of any other option, to pay it sideways. Not back to the person who had given it, he couldn't, but forward to whoever needed it next. Over the years that followed, Robert Hines became the person in his community who showed up when someone was in trouble. He drove people to chemotherapy appointments, sometimes waiting 4 and 5 hours in hospital corridors with a paperback he wasn't really reading. He sat with families in waiting rooms. He learned, through trial and error, how to be present with people in crisis without making it about himself, a specific and undervalued skill that most people never develop because it requires having been on the other side of it first. He organized collections for neighbors facing medical bills, contributing more than he could comfortably afford because he had a private and unshakable understanding of what it meant to be on the other side of that particular desperation. He never explained why he did these things. It was not a story he told to make himself look generous. It was a debt he was servicing to an unknown creditor, and he intended to keep servicing it for as long as he lived. 30 years passed. In the spring of 2004, Robert's younger daughter, Angela, was working as an events coordinator in Nashville. She was 34 years old, the same age her father had been in the parking lot of Nashville General, and part of her job involved managing the logistics of a charity gala being held in the city, a fundraiser for a children's medical foundation. One of the attendees, a woman whose name appeared on the guest list in connection with a significant donation, was Tina Turner. Angela Hines had grown up with the story of the envelope. She had her own version of it, the version that a child constructs from the fragments of adult conversation she overhears, more romantic than the facts, more certain about the details. She had never expected to come any closer to solving it. But she was a thorough person, and thorough people follow threads, and the thread she followed in the weeks before the gala was a simple one. Tina Turner had lived in the Nashville area in the early 1970s. She had been, during that period, a working musician with more demands on her generosity than she had resources to meet, and yet every account of her from that period described someone who gave anyway, consistently and without announcement, and the year of the check was 1974. Angela did not go to her father with a theory. She went with a question. She asked him to describe, one more time, everything he remembered about the woman in the car. Robert was 61 years old. The memory was 30 years old. But some memories don't fade the way others do. They stay precise because they were formed in moments when everything mattered. He described the woman again. Black, roughly his age, sunglasses, a scarf around her hair, something about the way she held herself in the driver's seat that he had never been able to articulate, but had never forgotten. Angela showed him a photograph from 1974, taken at a Nashville venue during a performance, a press photograph, the kind that ends up in archives. She showed it to him without saying whose it was. Robert looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "That could be her. That could be the woman." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who is that?" Angela told him. His daughter said later that she had expected some dramatic response, tears or disbelief, or the kind of reaction that 30 years of wondering produces when it finally reaches an answer. What Robert Hines actually did was sit down on the kitchen floor. Not collapse, just sit down, deliberately, as if his legs had made a calm decision that the chair was too far away. He sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes and didn't say anything. Then he got up, went to the family Bible, and took out the letter he had written to his daughters on the morning of October 9th, 1974. The letter he had put there because he didn't know what else to do with what he needed to say. He had never removed it in 30 years. He read it. Then he folded it again and put it back. There was no way to reach Tina Turner directly. Robert was not naive about the distance between a retired warehouse worker in Nashville and one of the most famous performers in the world. But Angela, through her events work, had a contact. A letter was written. It was passed through the appropriate hands. Whether it reached her and what she made of it was never made public. What was made public in a small Nashville newspaper in 2005 in a feature about quiet acts of community generosity was Robert Hines' side of the story. The reporter had come to write about his volunteer work, the decades of showing up for neighbors in medical crisis, the unbroken chain of returned favors that stretched back to a parking lot in 1974. Robert told the story of the envelope as context for all of it. The reporter asked him if he had ever found out who sent it. Robert said that he had a strong belief about that now, though he couldn't prove it. He said it didn't change anything about what he'd spent 30 years doing. He said the point of what he'd tried to do was never about knowing who to thank. It was about making sure the thing that happened to him happened to someone else, the experience of being in the worst moment and having an envelope arrive anyway. He said, "Somebody decided that my life was worth $11,400 on a morning when I had given up. I have been trying to be that somebody for other people ever since." Robert Hines died in 2019 at the age of 76. His obituary, written by his daughters, mentioned the surgery, the envelope, and the 30 years of showing up for strangers in hospital corridors and waiting rooms and moments of crisis that looked from the outside like ordinary Tuesday afternoons. It mentioned the letter in the Bible, which his daughters had found when they were going through his belongings, still folded, still in the same place he had put it on the morning of October 9th, 1974, still carrying the words of a man who had not yet known he was going to live. Angela said later that reading it was the hardest thing she had ever done, and also the most clarifying. It made the 45 years that followed it legible in a way they hadn't been before. Every waiting room, every collection, every hour her father had spent sitting with someone in the worst moment of their life, all of it was in that letter, in reverse. All of it was the answer to what he had written when he thought there would be no answer. The point of the story was what Robert had done with an unanswerable gift. The point was the chain of it, the decision made on a kitchen floor in 2004 that 30 more years of not knowing had not changed anything about what he owed and to whom he owed it. The point was a man who had received something he could never repay and had spent his life repaying it anyway, sideways, forward, to whoever needed it next. That is what it looks like when generosity travels. Not as a transaction between two people who know each other's names, but as a thing that moves through time and changes shape and arrives again and again, in parking lots and hospital lobbies and kitchen tables, as an envelope with no return address and the exact amount that someone needs, and no explanation except the implicit one. Someone decided you were worth it. Tina Turner never confirmed or denied the story publicly. She didn't need to. What happened in a hospital parking lot in Nashville in October 1974 had already done everything it needed to do. It had kept a man alive long enough to spend 30 years keeping other people alive, and the chain of that was longer than any confirmation could make it. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories about the human beings behind music's greatest legends, and if someone once showed up for you in a moment when you had nothing left, tell us about it in the comments. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss one of these stories.